Hello and welcome to Whitwell and Anderson. This is a channel where we talk about economic, financial, and business things in simple terms. We're on gentrification and we'll be talking about the history of the city of Philadelphia. But I think we need to start, the reason why I'm doing history because it's easier to understand how something got somewhere once you understand the background of it. So let's start about what is gentrification. Gentrification is when you take one group of people and replace them by another group of people through financial means. The actual term gentrification came from a lady named Ruth Glass in London, where she was asked to do a survey about some people, and that's where it was termed gentrification. It comes from an old, I believe, French term of gentry, which meant the middle class of people. Now, there's some basic tools that are used in all gentrification processes, and I'm going to go over them briefly. One is redlining, where they actually mark certain areas where there'll be no investment. Reduction of services such as fire, police, that type of stuff, schools of that nature, education begins to decline. There's usually a rise of crime. There is something sometimes called restrictive covenants, which is in a lease, which pretty much says once you do purchase that home, you have certain obligations, whereas you may not be able to sell that to someone who doesn't correspond with what's in the lease. There's a rent gap theory where the price of rent gets so low that, or the property gets so deteriorated that it doesn't make sense to pay the taxes. Blockbusting is something that's used as a tool, not as much anymore, but what they would do, for example, is to pay a black lady with a baby carriage to walk down the street in a white neighborhood to sort of scare people. The more formal things came along with urban and slum removal, and that brought or brings food, pharmacy, and deserts like that, whereas the people who remain can't get what they need. System use or something called eminent domain, which we're going to talk about a bit later, where the government can declare a certain place needs to be changed, for lack of a better term. Let's talk a little bit about Philadelphia, the history of Philadelphia. It was founded in 1692 by William Penn. It was in the British Empire considered the third most important city for a while. And as you probably know, it was the second capital of the United States. It was also the largest city in the United States at one time. But in 1826, when the Erie Canal was built in New York, that opened a huge opportunity for Philadelphia as well. This is when the first, in the 1820s, 1840s, 1850s, is when you had a big wave of immigration to Philadelphia, to what is known as the Washington Avenue Pier in Philadelphia. And for those who are not familiar with it, that I believe is the third largest location where immigrants came. They came from Germany, they came from the Ukraine, they came from England, after, I believe, New York City and Boston. Roughly 1 million immigrants came through Washington Avenue Pier, and that represents about 5% of the population. At the turn of the 20th century, there became the first of a great migration of blacks from the South that started to move north to Philadelphia. The reason why that was because of opportunity. And why Philly was known as the workshop of the world. It was the place where they developed the first commuter car. There were plenty of jobs. The Penn Railroad, and railroads are really big, was in Philadelphia. And the Penn Railroad at that time was one of the biggest companies in the United States. Philadelphia was the main connection between Chicago and the East Coast, and it had many types of industries, factories where you would walk to work. The factories were located in neighborhoods But a common problem that occurred throughout this whole period of time is they never planned for enough housing. An area called Kensington, which is known now, we're going to go into a little bit later, was a diverse factory area where they had glass shops, they made textiles, pottery, they used steels and chemicals. It was a really working class Irish black area, and what happened later on is there became the second Great Migration. That was between 1940 and 1970, where blacks began to move to the row houses of the north. A lot of them were in very poor conditions. There were some incidents where there were some buildings collapsed and people died, and lots of old housing. The federal government reacted under Franklin Delano Roosevelt by doing the Fair Housing and Fair Highway Act, which in the housing piece, it produced what is known as the 30-year mortgage. So that gave the people the first time to, the average guy, the first time to buy a house. But along with that, the highway piece of it brought in what is known as transit-oriented gentrification, which means basically a lot of places were built out, and the exit and the egress and ingress ramps, exits and exit ramps, and the highways were built through a lot of neighborhoods that were black and Hispanic, and which they considered bad neighborhoods, and some of them were really, really very nice. And the FHA came on in 1936, and the loan redlining, as we talked about before, became more of a fact. As the while goes in 1944, President Truman implemented the urban renewal, and as you talked about, eminent domain program, and that really brought in a lot of destruction, a lot of white flight, a lot of urbanization began. The GI Bill in itself had discriminatory practices toward a lot of the black veterans. They couldn't take advantage of it. And speaking of transit-oriented gentrification, in 1957, the National Defense and Highway Act came into effect, and that totally made a tremendous impact in a lot of areas. Because what it did is, well, the term I'm using now wasn't used back then, but it was something called shovel ready. In other words, the federal government would provide 90% of the resources, the locality would provide 10% of the resources to build out, but the decision on where to build these ramps rested with the local government. And during that time, there was a lot of local governments that were that practiced discrimination and used that against demolishing some prosperous black neighborhoods. In 1948, Harry Truman passed something called Operation Bootstrap. Now, what that did was that it was in Puerto Rico, where they tried to get Puerto Rico to become more industrialized and more agriculture. The result of that, a lot of the Puerto Ricans moved from Puerto Rico and moved to Philadelphia. It was quite a large bit of Puerto Rican population there. The 70s and the 60s, industry began to leave the city. Black bottom in some areas that were marginal started to slip. Temple University began an expansion in 1968, 1969, which really had a tremendous impact on a lot of the homes. And well, I said talk about Kensington, which is in the news a lot now. Kensington is and was a very dangerous area. Now Kensington is becoming gentrified. It's about 50% white and 50% others. So that's starting to change. The one thing about Philadelphia that was interesting is that Philadelphia never really got, I'm going to call it, the break that Boston and New York had. It always remained just on a little level below there. At one time, and I believe as of today, Philadelphia is the poorest major city in the United States, and the money is so tight that they are actually closing schools. I believe they closed 10% of the schools in Philadelphia. Drug, crime, and poverty are really rampant. I hope you enjoyed the video. I need you to give me a thumbs up. I need you to subscribe, and you have a great day. Bye.